So I'm going to talk a little bit about Hanrahan refrigerator cars and some models. This was something that was put together in the last few weeks to fill a slot. So you can see the Colorado Midland one on the left that we'll talk about a bit, and other railroads also operated them, including the Santa Fe. And what is spectacular on the Colorado Midland cars, of course, was the full-size, if not over life-size painting of a Ute Indian that was on the side, quite elaborate even for their day. So I'm going to talk about basically 3 or 4 different aspects here. A few notes on the Colorado Midland Railroad. Some of you may have heard of it, many not. It was one of the most, well, it was the last of the Colorado Trans-Mountain routes, the last to be built and the first to be abandoned. I'll talk a little bit about refrigerator cars in general, including the Tiffany, the Hanrahan, various configurations, and then some pictures and modeling notes on building cars for the Colorado Midland and the Santa Fe. So the Colorado Midland route essentially from, I'll show you a map in a moment, from the southeastern plains of the United States, south of Colorado Springs, through the middle of Colorado, heading up towards Grand Junction and connection to the west. So it was intended as a competition for the Union Pacific to take some of the transcontinental traffic from southeast to southwest. They had the shortest route in terms of miles of even track. They had some of the highest track anywhere. Their tunnel is, the Hagerman Tunnel was at 12,000 feet above sea level with many approaching trestles. So it was a very difficult route. They reached Leadville in 1898 as they shared the route west from Rio Grande, with the Rio Grande west from Leadville to Grand Junction. They were bankrupt essentially as soon as they opened, if not before. They were owned in shadow by the Santa Fe. Typically the Hagerman Pass, you can imagine at 12,000 feet in the Colorado Rockies, was not always open in the wintertime because of the snow. With the USRA arrangements, the US Railroad Administration took over all the railroads in the United States in late 1918 or 1918 roughly, and essentially ruined the Colorado Midland, so it was abandoned by 1919. So the map, Colorado is one of these square states in the US. So generally the outline of the state border is shown on in the square there. And so there's mountains over on the left here. The mountains sort of start here going up and down, plains over on the right, so it's flat, and then there's a wall. And the question is how to get over. Denver, as you know, is in the just on the edge of the plains. The mountains are in the background here. Pikes Peak, 14,000 feet, which includes a railway right up to the top here. So it gives you some idea that this is a fairly steep wall. Excuse me. Rio Grande ran out of Denver into Colorado Springs down here and then up the Arkansas River Gorge and through its way into Leadville. So everybody was trying to get a shorter way through. The Denver South Park and Pacific ran up through this way, ended up coming down like that. They had a high tunnel here at about 10,000 feet. But the Colorado Midland built the shortest route from Colorado Springs, actually just up in, just around the corner on one of the mountains from Manitou Springs up through to Hagerman Pass here, and then down and shared with the Rio Grande up into Leadville. So Leadville's about 10,000 feet, Denver's at 5,000. The Pikes Peak here is at 14,000 and the pass here is at 12. So there's a lot of wrinkly ground and high grades to get the trains through. So I got 3 pictures. What does people remember of the Colorado Midland? So the number one thing is usually this builder's photo of the refrigerator cars. There were about 30 altogether in that particular group. It's not clear whether they were all painted in this elaborate scheme. You can see that it's quite attractive. Yellow sides with the red ends and black underframe, and then the elaborate painting of the Ute Indian on the side. Another famous image of the Colorado Midland is its track along beside the Arkansas River, which you can just see here. And where did it go? It's disappeared. And then the Rio Grande track, which you can see actually in the image, is narrow gauge, and the Colorado Midland track with the locomotive 18 here in the front. And they had a number of these pierced tunnels along this beside the river. There's a geologic name for this, but I'm forgetting what it is. And today, the track is gone. The Rio Grande track is over here on the left, just down the hill where it used to be, or it used to be there, no longer owned by the Rio Grande, of course. And there were actually a series of these tunnels. This is looking in the other direction, and you can see about 5 of them. So it's a feature in which the geography has rocks, how should we say, fingers sticking out from the side of the mountain, which is off to the right on this picture, with the pierced tunnels going between them. The other famous image of the Colorado Midland is the loops and trestles on the ascent into Hagerman Pass. And you can just see the track. I think this view is taken looking from the west towards the east. So coming then, you can see running up the track up here, snow sheds and tunnels. Up through this way, there's a train here. You can see the smoke, a huge trestle here, some more snow sheds running their way up here and then into the tunnel up here at the top. So this is about 12,000 feet here. If you go to this part of the world, I haven't been on this, but I've been to several of the others. The advice that I give flatlanders such as ourselves who live at about 200 feet above sea level is absolutely do not fly into the country and then go up into this 12,000 foot level. You'll find yourself gasping for breath quite a bit. Actually can be a bit dangerous, I guess. So the best thing to do is to fly into Denver, as usually that happens. Spend at least a day in Denver to acclimatize yourself, Denver at 5,000 feet, before you head up into this part of the world. So the trestles were huge. As you can see here, they've cleaned out most of the trees, I guess, to make the trestles. They're interesting bridges in the sense that widespread on them, but two bents going straight up and down, and then the side ones. So they're fairly lightly built, actually. And then 2 locomotives, and I think there's 8 cars here in a caboose. So short trains on the steep grades. They did do a substantial depot at Leadville. You can see here they have their Pikes Peak Route Diamond Herald up here in the Colorado Midland image on the side of the chimney there. Now, refrigerator car configurations, they came in all sorts of flavors. Preceding the turn of the previous last century, at 1890, there were quite a few variations in refrigerator cars that were being dealt with. The Tiffany, which had a patent in 1877, in fact included most of the things which we think of as being refrigerator car technology. So they had a roof-length ice loading hatch. They had interior ventilation and circulation in the drainage. And as far as I can tell by just looking at the patents briefly, the only innovation in the Hanrahan had to do with the center ice loading and some interior circulation. Of course, these days, the refrigerator cars on the railroads that we have today typically have end ice bunker. One of the most impractical considerations in building and operating refrigerator cars was to ensure that there was equalized cooling of the contents, so that some parts or some of the produce didn't freeze while some of it was melting, and to make sure that the meltwater from the ice that was cooling the car was drained away properly to keep the cargo dry. It was also important to try and keep the moisture level down so that you didn't get accumulation of cold water on the produce inside. So the Tiffany patent, this is the drawing from the patent office, one of them, shows all of the features which we see on the refrigerator cars. So roof ice hatch loading, you can see them along the top here. There are vents which allow exterior air to enter the car and to provide airflow to keep the cargo dry. Overhead ice bunker here where the ice was stored. And then the insulated sides, ends, and doors. You can see the double doors insulated and the double insulation on the sides. So it's all the basic features of a refrigerator car are actually in the Tiffany patent from 1877. You can see that most of it, what we see as model railroaders, is the outside of the car. And we're interested in the features those that show on the exterior, because those are the ones we have to build into our models. But really the magic in these cars is in the inside. And so this reproduces the, excuse me, the Tiffany patent drawing. And you can see the ice bunkers up here in the top, the air vent, which connects down in to assist in draining the meltwater tanks, which are down here to accumulate the melting from the ice. And then there was several layers of installation, as well as vents around the side and the floor to ensure flow of air around the produce, which was in the section here in the center. Generally, when the cars were actually built, the patent drawing appears quite often in illustrations for models. They were never built this way. As far as I can tell, the cupola with the ice in it was usually integrated in the roof, so the sides extended up to the top and down. So the Hanrahan patent, it's hard to tell what they did that was better than the Tiffany arrangement. They had the double walls with the insulation and perhaps an extra air of insulation. They ensured in their description that there was airflow. They put the ice bunker in the middle. Not quite sure why, because essentially that makes it cold in this area, and somehow you have to get the cold from here to keep the cargo evenly cooled. And so they had air vents to do that along the sides. Not clear how practical it was. They had two doors to get at the two separate sides. This may have been, the two doors may partly have been an attempt to allow for smaller cargo loads so that they could have smaller shipments. But I suspect that in fact, really the disadvantage was with two doors, there was leakage in terms of thermal leakage, and so they didn't stay as cold as they should have. So if you look at a refrigerator car today, typically they are all the Tiffany features with a few other things, but generally the Hanrahan arrangement was not used outside of the 2 or 3 examples that I'll show you later on. So here is a narrow gauge refrigerator car in the Denver South Park and Pacific. You can see the features here, the end vent to allow for the airflow on the end. The roof hatches for the ice going in and out are on the roof. This particular car was originally equipped with vacuum brakes, so you can just see the vacuum cylinder here on the bottom, and these actually sort of crumpled when the vacuum was applied to it to apply the brakes. And then here is, I realized when I made this picture that I'd stuck the wrong air hose on here. This is actually just a casting for what would be an airline, so it's got the valve on it. But the ones that were actually used on the vacuum were armored hoses that had to withstand the external pressure. So I need to replace that. I apologize for that bad picture. The full-length overhead ice bins were quite common here in Canada, actually right through to the end on the Canadian cars. So this is a picture of one of the CN ones. The CPR had ones that were virtually identical, but they had 8 hatches along the roof and the together with the ice tank on the top. So it's very similar to the Tiffany design. 2 things to note on the underside, one of which are the drains for the meltwater. If you're building cars, of course, you need to make sure you put those on. They allowed the water to dribble out. But of course, Canadian cars, if you're building Canadian one is, Canadian cars are distinctive because we have to have heaters in our refrigerator cars in order to keep the contents from freezing cold in the Canadian winters. If it gets down to -0, below 0 Fahrenheit, that's much too cold for most contents being shipped. And so the charcoal heaters were applied to Canadian cars in order to heat the contents in the winter, in addition to keeping them cool. So enough about Hanrahan and refrigerator cars. A little bit about some of the users of them. I've only come across reference to 3, the Colorado Midland ones, which are the famous ones. The Santa Fe also had quite a few. And one image of the Michigan Central has shown up, but I haven't found anything else showing the Hanrahan cars in operation. So here's an example of the kind of research one needs to do, although I didn't start with this image, but it shows Colorado Midland Railway in Colorado with some refrigerator cars at the front. And what is important is the one right behind the locomotive, which when you blow up the image, you can see is the Hanrahan car with the 2 doors and the hatches in the middle. Excuse me, in this particular case, it's a later paint job. You can also see one of the characteristics of the Colorado Midland here. 1, 2, 3, 4, about 6 cars and a locomotive. If we go back to the other, there's 3 locomotives on that train and about 15 to 18 cars. So not too economic to move a lot of traffic. One other picture of a Colorado Midland car with the Ute Indian display on it down, as you can just see here. This, I believe, is in Leadville. There's another view that shows a little bit to the left. But other than that, pictures of the Colorado Midland cars with the Ute Indian display on them are quite rare. So moving on to models, way back in the 1960s, LaBelle did a really nice kit, very nice kit for its day with a wood body and dry transfer lettering for the Colorado Midland and the Hanrahan. And then a wonderful decal was provided for the illustration. And so they assembled quite nicely and made a nice car. Many people probably had them on their layout, as I did too. More recently, however, some resin kits have been done by Proto West company in Colorado and Denver. I'm not sure if they have any more in stock. I did get my kits a few years ago. The illustration shows a couple of models under construction in a couple of stages. Essentially, it's a one-piece resin car body with an underframe insert. So they're actually fairly easy to assemble. Essentially, you add the grab irons to the sides and the roof, as you can see here. There's the grab irons. I'm not sure I've got them all straight. You detail the underbody and add the brakes. You paint and lighter, and then you can enjoy them on your layout. So I'm going to take you through some of the steps of of doing that assembly. It's relatively easy. Part of the reason for doing so, however, is to just illustrate some of the techniques that are happening. So this is actually the car after you get it all together. You can see it's fairly nice work on the body, on the resin casting. The underframe has been done. I noticed on the illustration, if you guys were looking carefully, you would have seen a couple of nut bolt thingies in the corner just below the straps here, which I suspect were related to rods that were tying the sides together. I noticed these were on the picture, but not on the model. So I cut off some bolt heads and put them on the side to make them a little bit more authentic. So building the cars, when you build them, it's a good idea to add the interior weights so that they roll on the track better. And one of the hardest things to remember if you're building kits is to put the lead weights in and secure them securely before you put the body together. They're much easier to get in when the car body is still accessible. These are lead weights I get from in a strip from Canadian Tire. They have a self-adhesive pad on the bottom, so they stick, but I usually run a bead of silica seal around the sides and over the top to make sure there's no possibility of them ever coming out when it's in the car. The silicone doesn't show here because it was a clear tube I used. Most of the work in putting the cars together after you get the grab irons installed on the side is actually on the underside, which seldom shows up in the model. I did on these cars, on some of them, put some hex bolts on for attaching the coupler pockets, just because that looks better than a screw head when you look at the model when it's on the track. I added some strips here on the bolsters together with some nut bolt washers that showed up in the pictures. And I added some chains on this particular car to provide the hooks to hold I provided some hooks to hold the chains, which come from the brake beams on the trucks. We'll see that again in a minute. On the first car I assembled, when I did this a couple of years ago, I had just got some small taps and dies for doing small threads. And so I decided to try threading the turnbuckles. And so as you can see here, it's a brass turnbuckle, and I've threaded the ends of the rods and tapped and threaded the holes in the turnbuckles. And then these actually thread together. Now I only had the one-handed of the die and tap to make the regular conventional screws, which you turn to the right in order to make them go in. So these don't actually work in the sense that if you turn the turnbuckle, it just slides back and forth because the threads down here are running the same way, both ways. So it was an interesting idea. I'm not sure it was worth the effort, and I haven't done, well, I did it on some other cars. On the trucks, I did some work to try and apply the outside brake beams. So the truck as it came here was this arrangement with just the flat sides and no brake beams. I added a brass plate with some brackets, which then held the brake beams and the brake shoes in place. And then as you can just see dangling are some little chains which connect them to those little hooks we saw in the previous illustration. Actually, most of the cars, real cars, had two sets of chains. One was connected to the brake shoes themselves, which kept them from falling off if there was some breakage. And then there were chains also holding the rods that did the application of for the brakes. So those wouldn't fall on the track if those broke as well in service. One of the things you can see with this illustration, and I didn't realize this until I was putting this chart deck together, is the difference between scale wheels or Proto 87 scale wheels and the big, fat, ugly NMRA standard wheels. You can also understand why, I can see Grant's yawning there. I'm sorry, I'm putting him to sleep already. That you can see why your trucks don't always fit under your models. Because of the fat wheels, the side frames on HO trucks are actually further apart than is required, than the scale width. And I think there's an NMRA standard for that. But you can see when you put the real scale wheels in, that the side frames could be pushed in considerably, and that would make them work better on the layout for turning and so on. However, I have discovered, much to my sorrow, that these little ones with the tiny flanges really don't work on HO scale track other than just on straight track sections. Putting the cars together is a matter of putting a lot of details in. There's a lot of handrails to add, a few nut bolt washers to add as well. I noticed, and this is common with many cars, that the lowest grab iron on the end typically has this double bend on it, so it's attached at the top of the bolt, not the bottom. So the brakeman could grab this and then lean in order to pull the pins or do whatever they needed to work on the couplers. That's common both on these Colorado Midland cars as well as a lot of others. Lots of other details to add on the ends of the cars. One of the most tedious parts of doing the building is once you've got the grab irons in, you have to paint all these things black. So it takes a steady hand and some black paint. I use the Tamiya semi-gloss black for painting these things. You can also see that the roof walk has been painted a different color than the roof. Typically the roof walks were unpainted boards, partly so that they weren't slippery from the paint, but also because any paint you did put on wore off due to the hobnail boots that the brakemen often wore. So it's an interesting detail on your models if they have a wooden roof walk to paint it a different color than the roof. A few details on the underside. This is after it's been painted. The cars had drains on the bottom to let the water out. There were usually two of them, and I'm not sure where the second one is in this particular illustration. I put this view in also to show the underside of the car. Generally, the underside of wooden freight cars were not painted. Only the metalwork and the brake system equipment was painted, usually with a rust-resisting paint. I'm not sure I've got the color right here, but it's an interesting detail. In addition to painting your roof walks a different color, to be painting the undersides a different color, just because they were unpainted. So I put this illustration in to show how much, in fact, it shows up on the cars when you look at the underside. But typically, of course, we never see the underside of a prototype car. Hopefully, the Colorado Midland turned over a few of their cars on their sides on one of their trips, and we get to see the underside. These are steel cars with a steel frame. You can see the underframe is painted black. You can see the trucks are not attached to the cars. They don't have any 256 screws to hold them in place. And a derailment such as this, where the locomotive is just visible up here, where they've done a turnover, is also a bit of a Sunday afternoon excursion. And you can see that the dog and some of the ladies have climbed up onto the side of the car in order to enjoy the scenery, so to speak, or to have a look at what was happening. Interesting that all of the trucks from the cars have fallen off. So fortunately, that doesn't happen too often on our models. One of the things that's interesting when you look at this car is that it has two steps, one on the side and one on the end. And that's a typically Canadian practice. And so that tells us when we're looking at this because we're enthusiastic model railroaders, that this may be the Colorado Midland, but this is a Canadian Pacific boxcar, one of the outside frame cars that were quite typical, and it would have been brand new when this picture was taken. You can also see just down in here, the CPR and the car number stenciled on the side of the trucks. And if you spend any time under cars or looking under them in detail, typically the trucks were all stenciled with the road name and the car number for exactly this reason. If the truck and the car ever became separated, it was easier for the wrecking crew to get the right trucks associated with the right cars. Typically, the trucks themselves, the various components were also stenciled with the car number and the railroad, because sometimes the cars came apart in wrecks such as this. Somewhere up on this frame will also be the car number as well. So the underside of the car was stenciled with the car number so that if it ever got separated from the car body, and quite often the body turned into toothpicks and only the frame was left, so they could get those back together. But you can see the quite contrasting color between the unpainted floorboards and the rest of the car. So eventually we get our cars together and they need to be painted. I have in recent years been using these paint brackets I made up. This is just the pierced strap steel with the ends cut off to provide a little hole at the top here that can be, I use the truck screw to fasten it in, and then it's fastened onto a board with enough clearance such that I can grab the base here and then spray from all different sides, including the underframe. When I'm doing the spray painting, you've got to get the weight of this board balanced such that it will stand up and not fall over with the weight of the car on the top. One of the things you learn by experience. These cars, of course, 3 colors involved, so it's 3 trips to the airbrush and the masking. Yellow sides, which has been done here. You can see the Hanrahan Refrigerator at the bottom. Typically, the roof and ends were red with a black underframe or some kind of dark color painted. So it's 3 trips to the airbrush. So we're getting towards the end here. One of the attractions of these cars is, of course, they've got lots of lettering on them so that there's lots to see. It also means that it's a major step in the model to put all the lettering on. So I just point out here while I'm thinking about it, you can see the chains and the brake shoes on the trucks, and the turnbuckles are open, but certainly from this distance, you can't see the threading of the turnbuckles. So that's why I don't do it anymore. So lots of lettering to apply. It's important to have reference images so that you can match up the lettering and where it needs to go out. I typically trim all of the lettering fairly close to the edges. And they should have done this first, of course, but I usually, when I'm doing the paint, sometimes I put gloss in with the focal so that instead of getting a flat surface, you get a shiny surface on it. That's good for the sides anyway. Anywhere you're going to put the decals on, it's best to have a glossy surface to put them on. So they get cut out and trimmed carefully, soaked in the water, applied in position. On these particular cars, the decal set as it was printed for this refrigerator line, part of the herald here, it was too long. It overlapped the door. It was about that long. So one had to cut a section out of here and squish it back together. One also needed to do a little choosing of the numbers so you didn't end up with all the cars with the same number, or sometimes I do that just so I don't have the same number as everybody else's car kit. On these cars, a lot of the lettering was on the ends because they had the colorful sides. So you can see the dimensional data here together with the weighing date and the typical stuff that was on the end, which dealt with the repack dating of the dates for the wheels. If you look really closely, you can see here a few cut lines from some of the decals. So I apologize for that. Usually that doesn't show up, and it disappears in any case when you put a flat or a semi-flat finish over it. There is some, it's good to have a good workspace for when you're doing the decaling. So, and one of the most important things to remember is to have a wet side and a dry side, because you never know when you might spill water or splash it, and you don't want to get wet from the water onto decals that are not yet ready to be applied. So I keep things separated in this way. You can see that there's the car ready to be lettered, the information that I need in order to make sure I get everything right. It really does help to have the picture of the car in front of you so that you end up with things in the right spot. The decals that are not being immediately applied are in a plastic bag up above the work surface so that any spill or damage down here doesn't affect them. So a dish with water that has just one drop of dish detergent in it so that it's not just water out of the tap. I have two brushes, one which I use for applying the water to the model before I slide the decal on, and the second brush which is used to apply the Solvaset coating on the top. A set of dividers are used in order to do alignments. So one measures from the top or the bottom to make sure one has a straight line to get things lined up. There's nothing worse than having them get things on crooked and not discovered until after they have dried up. So there's some probes of various things, screwdrivers, knives, etc., which one used to poke the decal in order to move it around. The scissors, which are not shown, are used for trimming the letters to get things on. Then carefully, I usually cut on this side here, the decal. I collect all of the scraps that have been cut, because you never know when you might do a cut for a part that you're going to put on and have a little piece that's got needed later for somewhere else that you forgot and missed. So if I do find them, they go in the bag and can be used later. Otherwise, they get kept here, and I can sometimes find them later. So the notes on doing the decaling. I mentioned that the Colorado Midland and the Santa Fe were two of the major users, if that's the right word, of the Hanrahan refrigerators. Only found two pictures of the Hanrahans on the Santa Fe. The one at the top is the one you see most often. The second one, which was the second batch that were built, not quite such a good image, and I don't have the actual images better than this, but I couldn't find it when I was putting this together. So very similar lettering, refrigerator car, or somewhat longer lettering up here. One of the things you'll want to note that I'll mention again is if you look at the Santa Fe, there is an accent on the E. The only other picture that I've seen of these cars is of a wreck that was somewhere in Colorado. You can see two of the Colorado Midlands on the, rather of the Hanrahan Reefers on the Santa Fe, one back here, which is one of the earliest ones because it has just a simple roof walk. No, I'm sorry, it's back here is the other Hanrahan. The one at the leading edge here is one of the later build ones, which has some side hatches, or rather not hatches, but roof walks towards the diagonal roof walks. You can also notice how the roof walk does have a bend in as it goes up and over. It's not a bend, it's actually different levels as they go up and over over where the roof hatches are at the top. So the Santa Fe car, almost the same. This is what the body looked like as it was being assembled. You can see the double strap hinges on the side doors instead of the three that were used on the others. And here is the finished car after the decals and the letters have been applied. Just a note for the detail fanatics here. The Colorado Midland cars were built by Pullman. So they had the Pullman Builders logo down in this area. These cars were built by American Car and Foundry. So that's their builder's plate here. And something I didn't notice until recently, that's why I'm mentioning it, the decal set, as beautiful as it is missing the accent on the Santa Fe. So it's a Santa Fe car instead of a Santa Fe car, depending on how you would read your accents, I guess. Wanted to mention the trucks. When I built the first car, I rebuilt the some plastic ones that I had to get the outside brake shoes as I illustrated earlier. In building the later cars, the last four, I tried some trucks from Shapeways, and some perusing of their catalog indicated they had outside brake beam arch bar trucks. And I thought that would save a lot of work in doing the mounting of the brake shoes and getting a side frame that was somewhat appropriate. So you can see the Shapeways printing here. I think I bought a couple of packages just to make sure I had enough, but the basic package came with, I think, 12 printed trucks. You can see after you've cut them off and then done and then they've been painted. They're, as you'll see again in a minute, they're okay, but I'm not sure that I would recommend them. They are transparent, as I mentioned. They're very fragile. I found I had to put little drops of ACC in the corners here in order to reinforce them. They promptly broke off when I just was trying to get them off. So you do that and you get at least a car that can go together. So they do get on the, this is what they look like from the underside on the cars. So they're okay. One of the things you can see in this illustration is it's kind of a pebbled surface on the printed castings. So they may have a finer grain of or grade of printing available, but this is what I thought. I was getting a decent one, but it didn't turn out to be as good as it should be. Here I've underpainted the underframe a dark gray color instead of the lighter color that I'd used previously. Perhaps a bit more realistic to the weathered gray that would often end up on the cars underneath. The only other railroad that I have come across that had the Hanrahan reefers was the Michigan Central. And this is the only photograph I've ever stumbled upon. It's actually a different car in a way. It has passenger car trucks on it, which seems unusual, or at least they sort of look like passenger car type trucks, and end platforms. But that's all I've ever seen, and I've never seen any models built of those particular cars. So here we come to the end. A view on the Colorado Midland with a couple of their cabooses. This looks like the edge of the benchwork here, but actually it's one of the rivers going up and down. But I put this picture also in partly because it's Colorado Midland, but also they had quite distinctive cabooses with the, I don't know what you'd call it, the S-shaped curves on the cupola roofs and side doors on them. So they were used not only for caboose traffic, but for a little bit of light less than carload lot type of traffic as well. So that is the end, as I even put that up here so that I would know. So I'll stop sharing.